After years of slumber and permanent counter-revolution, there are signs of a new period of struggle, with youth as the new carriers of revolutionary infection. But the society of the spectacle paints its own picture of itself and its enemies, imposes its own ideological categories on the world and its history. Fear is the very last response, for everything that happens is reassuringly part of the natural order of things. Real historical changes, which show that this society can be superseded, are reduced to the status of novelties, processed for mere consumption. The revolt of youth against an imposed, quote, given, unquote, way of life is the first sign of a total subversion. It is the prelude to a period of revolt. The revolt of those who can no longer live in our society. Faced with the danger, ideology and its daily machinery perform an unusual inversion of reality. An historical process becomes a pseudo-category of some social natural science and the idea of youth. Youth is in revolt, but this is only the eternal revolt of youth every generation espouses. Quote, good causes, unquote, only to forget them when, quote, the young man begins the serious business of production as given concrete and real social aims, unquote. After the social scientists come the journalists with their verbal inflation. The revolt is contained by overexposure. We are given it to contemplate so that we shall forget to participate. In this spectacle, a revolution becomes a social aberration. In other words, a social safety valve, which has its part to play in the smooth working of the system. It reassures because it remains a marginal phenomenon in the apartheid of the temporary problems of a healthy pluralism. Compare and contrast to the, quote, woman question, unquote, and the, quote, problem of racialism, unquote. In reality, if there is a problem of youth in modern capitalism, it is part of the total crisis of that society. It is just that youth feels the crisis most acutely. Youth and its mock freedoms are the purest product of modern society. Their modernity consists in the choices they are offered and already making. Total integration into neo-capitalism, or the most radical refusal. What is surprising is not that youth is in revolt, but that its elders are so soporific. But the reason is history, not biology. The previous generation lived through the defeats and were sold the lies of the long, shameful disintegration of the revolutionary movement. In itself, youth is a publicity myth, and as part of the, quote, social dynamism, unquote, it is the potential ally of the capitalist mode of production. The illusory primacy of youth began with the economic recovery of the Second World War. Capital was able to strike a new bargain with labor. In return for the mass production of a new class of manipulable consumers, the worker was offered a role which gave him full membership of the spectacular society. This, at least, was the idea of the social model, though as usual it bore little relation to socio-economic reality, which lagged behind consumer ideology. The revolt of youth was the first burst of anger at the persistent realities of the new world. The boredom of everyday existence, the dead life which is still an essential product of modern capitalism, in spite of all its modernizations. A small section of youth is able to refuse that society and its products, without any ideas that this society can be superseded. They opt out for a nihilist present. Yet the destruction of capitalism was once again a real issue, an event in history, a process which has already begun. Dissident youth must achieve the coherence of a critical theory, and the practical organization of that coherence. At the most primitive level, the, quote, delinquents, unquote, blason noir, of the world must use violence to express their rejection of society and its sterile options. But their refusal is an abstract one. It gives them no chance of actually escaping the contradictions of the system. They are its products, negative, spontaneous, but nonetheless exploitable. All the experience of the new social order produced them. They are the first side effects of the new urbanism, of the disintegration of all values, of extensions of increasingly boring consumer leisure, of the growing control of every aspect of everyday life by the psycho-human police force, and of the economic survival of the family unit, which has lost all significance. The young thug despises work but accepts the goods he wants. He wants what the spectacle offers him, but now, with no down payment. This is the essential contradiction of the delinquent's existence. He may try for real freedom in the use of his time, in an individual assertiveness, and even a construction of a kind of community. But the contradiction remains and kills. On the fringe of society where poverty reigns, the gang develops its own hierarchy, which can only fulfill itself in a war with other gangs, isolating each group and each individual within the group. In the end, the contradiction proves unbearable. Either the lure of the product world proves all too strong, and the hooligan decides to do an honest day's work. To this end, a whole sector of production is devoted specifically to his recuperation, Clothes, records, guitars, scooters, transistors, Purple Hearts beckon him to the land of the consumer, or else is forced to attack the laws of the market itself, either in the primary sense by stealing or in a move towards conscious revolutionary critique of commodity society. For the delinquent, only two futures are possible: revolutionary consciousness or blind obedience on the shop floor. The provosts are the first organization of delinquency. They have given the delinquent experience its first political form. They are an alliance of two distinct elements: a handful of careerists from the degenerate world of art, and a mass of beatniks looking for new activity. The artists contribute the idea of the game, though still dressed up in various threadbare ideological garments. The delinquents have nothing to offer but the violence of their rebellion. From the start of the two tendencies hardly mixed, the pre-ideological mass found itself under the Bolshevik, quote, guidance, unquote, of the artistic ruling class who justified the maintained power by an ideology of provo-democracy. And at the moment when the sheer violence of the delinquent had become an idea, an attempt to destroy art and go beyond it, the violence was channeled into the crassest new artistic reformism. The provs are an aspect of the last reformism produced by modern capitalism, the reformism of everyday life. Like Bernstein, with his vision of socialism built by tinkering with capitalism, the provo hierarchy think they can change everyday life by a few well-chosen improvements. They fail to realize the banality of everyday life is not incidental, but the central mechanism and product of modern capitalism. To destroy it, nothing less is needed than all-out revolution. The provs choose the fragmentary end by accepting the totality. To give themselves a base, the leaders have concentrated the paltry ideology of proletariat, a politico-artistic salad knocked up from the leftovers of a feast they had never known. The new proletariat is supposed to oppose the passive and the bourgeois proletariat, still worshipped in obscure leftist shrines. Because they despair of the fight for the total change in society, they despair of the only force which can bring about the change. The proletariat is the motor of capitalist society, and thus its moral enemy. Everything is designed for its suppression: parties, trade unions, bureaucracies, the police, the colonization of all aspects of everyday life. The pros hardly try to understand any of this. Without a critique of the system of production, they remain its servants. And in the end, an anti-union workers' demonstration sparked off by real conflict, the prov base went back to direct violence, leaving their bewildered leaders to denounce excesses and appeal to pacifist sentiments. The provs who had talked of provoking authority to reveal its repressive character finished by complaining that they had been provoked by the police. So much for their pallid anarchism. It is true that the provo base became revolutionary in practice, but to invent a revolutionary consciousness, their first task is to destroy their leaders, to rally the objective revolutionary forces of the proletariat, to drop the constants and devise of this world. One of the favorite artists of the Dutch royal family, the failed MP and admirer of the English police. There is a modern revolution, and one of its bases could be the pros, but only without their leaders and ideology. If they want to change the world, they must get rid of these who are content to paint it white. Idle reader, your cry of, quote, "What about Berkeley?" escapes us not. True American society needs its students, and by revolting against their students, they can have automatically called that society in question. From the start, they have seen their revolt against the university hierarchy as a revolt against the whole hierarchical system, the dictatorship of the economy of the state, the refusal to become an integrated part of the commodity economy, to put their specialized studies to their obvious and inevitable use, is a revolutionary gesture. It puts in doubt that whole system of production which alienates activity and products from their creators. For all its confusion and hesitancy, the American student movement has discovered one truth of the new refusal, that a coherent revolutionary alternative can and must be found within the, quote, affluent society, unquote. The movement is still fixated on two relatively accidental aspects of American crisis, the Negroes and Vietnam, and the many groups of the left suffer from the fact. There is an authentic whiff of democracy in the chaotic organization, but what they lack is a genuine subversive content. Without it, they continually fall into dangerous contradictions. They may be hostile to the traditional politics of the old parties, but the hostility is futile and will be recuperated, so long as it's based on ignorance of the political system and naive illusions about the world situation. Abstract opposition to their own society produces facile sympathy with its apparent enemies, the so-called socialist bureaucracies of China and Cuba. A group like Resurgence Youth Movement can in the same breath condemn the state and praise the Cultural Revolution, that pseudo-revolt directed by the most elephantine bureaucracies of modern times. At the same time, these organizations, with their blend of libertarian political and religious tendencies, are always liable to the obsession with group dynamics, which leads to the closed world of a sect. The mass consumption of drugs is the expression of a real poverty and a protest against it, but it remains a false search for, quote, freedom, unquote, within a world dedicated to repression, a religious critique of a world that has no need for religion, least of all a new one. The beatniks, that right-wing youth revolt, are the main purveyors of an ideological, quote, refusal, unquote, combined with an acceptance of the most fantastic superstitions, Zen, spiritualism, New Church, mysticism, the stale porridge of Gandhiism and humanism. Worse still, in their search for a revolutionary program, the American students fall into the same bad faith as the provost and proclaim themselves the most exploited class in our society. They understand one thing, that there is no, quote, special, unquote, student interest in the revolution. Revolution will be made by all the victims of encroaching repression and the tyranny of the market. And for the East, bureaucratic totalitarianism is beginning to produce its own forces of negation. Nowhere is the revolt of the youth more violent and savagely repressed than the rising tide of press negotiations. The new police measures against, quote, hooliganism, unquote, are proof enough. A section of youth, so the right-minded, quote, socialist, unquote, functionaries tell us, have no respect for the moral family order, which still flourishes there in its most detestable bourgeois forms. They prefer, quote, debauchery, unquote, despise work, and even disobey the party police. The USSR has set up a special ministry to fight the new delinquency. Alongside this diffuse revolt, a more specific opposition is emerging. Groups and clandestine reviews will rise and fall with the barometer of police repression. So far, the most important has been the publication of the, quote, open letter to the Polish Workers' Party, unquote, by the young Poles Kiron and Modzelewski, which affirmed the necessity of, quote, abolishing the present system of production and social relations, unquote, and that, to do this, quote, revolution is unavoidable, unquote. The Eastern intellectuals have one great task, to make conscious and concrete the critical action of the workers of East Berlin, Warsaw, and Budapest, the proletarian critique of the dictatorship of the bureaucracy. In the East, the problem is not to define the aims of revolution, but to learn how to fight for them. In the West, struggle may be easy, but the goals are left obscure or ideological. In the Eastern bureaucracies, there are no illusions about what is being fought for, hence the bitterness of the struggle. What is difficult to do is to devise the forms revolution must take in its immediate future. In Britain, the revolt of youth found its first expression in the peace movement. It was never a wholehearted struggle, with the misty non-violence of the Committee of the 100 as its most daring program. At its strongest, the committee could call 300,000 demonstrators to the streets. It had the finest hour in spring 1963, with the, quote, spies for peace, unquote, scandal, but it had already entered on a definitive decline. For want of theory, the unilateralists fell among the traditional left or were recuperated by the pacifist conscience. What is left is the enduring, quintessential English archaism of the control of everyday life and the accelerating decomposition of the old secular values. These could still produce a total critique of the new life, but the revolt of the youth needs allies. The British working class remains one of the most militant in the world. Its struggles, the shop stewards movement, and the growing tempo and bitterness of wildcat strikes will be a permanent sore on an equally permanent capitalism, until it regains its revolutionary perspective and seeks common cause with the new oppression. The debacle of laborism makes that alliance all the more possible and all the more necessary. If it came about, the explosion could destroy the old society. The Amsterdam riots would be child's play in comparison. Without it, both sides of the revolution can only be stillborn. Practical needs will find no genuine revolutionary form, and rebellious discharge will ignore the only forces that drive and can therefore destroy modern capitalism. Japan is the only industrialized country where this fusion of student youth and working class militants has already taken place. Zengakuren, the Organization of Revolutionary Students, and the League of Young Marxist Workers joined to form the backbone of the Communist Revolutionary League. The moment is already setting and solving the new problems of the revolutionary organization. Without illusion, it fights both Western capitalism and the bureaucracies of the so-called socialist state. Without hierarchies, it groups together several thousand students and workers on a democratic basis and aims at the participation of every member in all activities of the organization. They are the first to carry the struggle onto the streets, holding fast to the real revolutionary program, and with a mass participation. Thousands of workers and students have waged a violent struggle with the Japanese police. In many ways, the CRL lacks a complete and concrete theory of the two systems it fights with such ferocity. It has not yet defined the precise nature of bureaucratic exploitation, and it has hardly formulated the character of modern capitalism, the critique of everyday life, and the critique of the spectacle. The Communist Revolutionary League is still fundamentally an avant-garde political organization. They are the best features of the classic proletarian movement. But it is, at present, the most important group in the world. and should henceforth be one of the poles of discussion and a rallying point for the new proletarian critique.